Θα ήθελα να ξεκινήσω ευχαριστώντας την Οργανωτική Επιτροπή του Ερευνητικού Πρόγραμματος A.P.Pir.A για την ευγενική πρόσκληση. Ελπίζω να με συγχωρήσετε που θα μεταπηδήσω στα αγγλικά, γεγονός που εξοικονομεί πολύ χρόνο. Στα ελληνικά η διάλεξη μου θα διορκήσει μια ώρα, στα αγγλικά τη μισή. We had a full day of presentations today, focusing on the archaic and later periods. So I have the somewhat dangerous task of walking the plank and introduce tomorrow's discussions on Bronze Age piracy. Not being a pirate myself, however, with my closest experience being eating Lηστικό, my knowledge is evidently secondhand, especially drawing from recent work by Hitchcock and Mayer, de Souza, Jung, Tartaron, Samaras, Miran, Emmanuel, and others. So I am, so to speak, pirating their work, which is at least appropriate in the present context. I'm not going to refer to Captain Hook, Sparrow, Barbarossa, Blackbeard, Blood, Morgan, or to other historical or fictional pirates, but it's clear that pirates speak to our collective imagination, largely because they were romanticized in literature and popular culture. This, as we all know, does not agree with reality. They were the scourge of the seas and still are, even if the number of pirate attacks is going down, as these numbers indicate. While the Mediterranean is relatively safe nowadays, the Libyan coast has seen an increase of pirate attacks, with ships venturing further away from the coast and threatening passing merchant ships. And other attacks have been noted in the Gulf of Guinea and the Straits of Singapore. But in contrast, Somali piracy, which was a scourge like about 15 years ago, is now negligible due to international policing in the Arabian Gulf. But let's stick to the topic of this meeting, the archaeology of piracy in antiquity, a theme that was already of interest to scholars during World War I. The connection with the war is probably important. When Ellen Churchill Semple wrote a paper, Pirate Coast of the Mediterranean Sea in 1916. I will, for obvious reasons, focus on Bronze Age Crete. And there's immediately a problem of anachronistically attributing later connotations, since the island evidently had a bad reputation not only in the Hellenistic and early Roman times, but again in the 9th and 10th centuries when Arabs originally from Spain used it as their base, and again later when, despite Venetian and later Ottoman control, it was on the receiving end, being plagued by Barbary pirates. Finding material traces of piracy is not an easy task, neither for historical nor for prehistoric times, since they have not left their signature in the destruction levels we encounter. So to obtain some kind of starting point, we necessarily have to turn to textual evidence and later historical parallels and see if these can help us to understand the Bronze Age evidence. As to the first, I cannot avoid noticing the almost honorable regard for sea raiders expressed in Homer, where most of the heroes commit acts of what we today would call piracy almost as a pastime, while busy laying siege at Troy. To kill time and to feed their armies, they take their boats and grab whatever they can in the region, women especially. But Homer is also careful not to call his heroes pirates, even if Thucydides does, while other lesser folk and foreigners are given the title, even there is no difference between their actions. Strictly speaking, however, and despite the use of the term listes and pirates, one can question whether real piracy is in fact mentioned in the epics, since the term usually implies persons who attack and rob ships at sea. We've heard some other definitions, of course, today. And where the Bronze Age is concerned, we should also ask whether there was really a fundamental difference between what we consider as acts of piracy and those committed by regular warriors or armies. The Mycenae Silver Siege write-on, for example, illustrates how one or more ships moored and a city was attacked. And a very similar representation is preserved on a stone vase from A.P.Pir.A. Pirates or heroes. If a pharaoh has his armies attacking a Levantine city, is this regular warfare? While if one city sends a ship to pillage another city, would this be piracy? The distinction is difficult to make, and more a matter of appreciation. Many scholars have tried to define piracy, but as far as the Aegean Bronze Age is concerned, Homer's uncertainty is probably close to the truth. But how can we identify pirates and piracy in the Bronze Age Aegean? Pirate expert Marcus Rediker already recognized three essential elements which large-scale piracy needed to fulfill. Pirates tend to blossom in anarchic regions that border crucial sea lanes. Second, pirates tend to exploit established maritime networks to prey on passing commerce. And third, and since randomly seized cargoes do not always contain foodstuffs essential for survival, pirates need a nest, a lair. That is, a nearby friendly community where they can trade their plundered cargoes for everyday essentials without consequence. This definition, I think, is quite revealing since it comprises several features that may be archaeologically relevant. The first is that piracy thrives in anarchic regions, as it did in the late 17th century AD, as you see on this map, which should imply that when strong authorities are present, piracy would be limited. It is such a situation already alluded at by Thucydides, when stating that King Minos suppressed piracy while installing a sea-based hegemony. Leaving aside whether this was just a way of introducing Athenian naval policy, there are plenty of historical parallels for this. The Barbary pirates were only suppressed when France took control of North Africa in the 1830s, more or less at the same time the US and European nations suppressed it in the Caribbean. This criterion would hence imply that we should concentrate on pirates without a sufficiently strong political force in the Aegean to look for pirate activities. This is not an easy task either, since a strong land-based authority not always possesses a navy to act in tandem. Pharaonic Egypt, for example, only invested into an ocean-going navy during the New Kingdom, and there's literary evidence that Keftiu ships docked at the harbor of Peri-Nefer. The absence of a strong authority after the fall of the Minoan and Mycenaean palaces is often invoked as giving rise to pirate activities during the late Bronze Age, evidently, and continue until the early Archaic period. Whether Crete or some Cretan power actually was responsible for suppressing pirate acts during the heydays of Minoan culture remains a possibility then. The fact that coastal Cretan cities do not seem to pay special attention to defensive structures could also suggest that the seas were safe and that no attacks were expected from that side. A second important criterion is the existence of crucial sea lanes, and we heard about this also, through which essential trade passed. Sea currents are, of course, different in summer and winter, but one assumes that most piracy would take place during the sailing months. 4th century Vegetius states that sailing in the Mediterranean was dangerous after September 15 and impossible after November 11. This said, the south coast of Crete is to be avoided during summer, since the mountains give rise to what are called katabatic squalls, a wind that carries high-density air from higher elevations down a slope under the force of gravity, which sometimes had hurricane force, as the Apostle Paul witnessed before reaching Callimenes. And as Buondelmonti already noticed, this coast could only be navigated by crews that knew the topography. But even the north coast was often avoided because of the strong Meltemi winds. And during the Crusades, ships going east would prefer to travel from the Ionian Sea close to the Peloponnese and hence through the Cyclades and the Dodecanese, with Crete being avoided. Trading ships would only approach Cretan shores if they were to board one of the major coastal towns, which in the Bronze Age would have been probably Chania, Poros, or Amnisos, and a few other places along the north coast that offer sufficient shelter, such as Suda Bay, the Spinalonga Lagoon, or Sitia. The north coast of Crete was in any case out of the question during winter because of the fierce winds. And even today, there are days, even in summer, when the winds are so strong that even the big ships cannot sail. A third criterion is the existence of a thriving maritime network, and Carl Nappert and colleagues have extensively published on this. They've concentrated on the main phases of Minoan trade and illustrate changes caused by the disappearance of Santorini Akrotiri. In general, the links they highlight testify to the dynamism of interaction during the Middle and early Late Bronze Age. But the advanced Late Bronze Age could do with some more attention, despite some initial attempts by Tom Tartaron and Alex Nodell. And lastly, pirates need a free haven, a place that offers safety, but also access to food and water, as we also heard from Kithera and Antique Israel. So we would also assume that such pirates' nests would reasonably be at some distance from these sea lanes to avoid detection. So where do we need to look, and what are we specifically looking for? Small islands are probably quite popular. Gavados, for example, was a pirate refuge later, and Barbarossa used it as his base one time. Dia and Spinalonga could be others. Somebody will not like this, but Pira Island, with its Minoan site, would in fact be a good candidate as a pirate settlement. Moklos too, with its original double harbor hidden by the island itself, could well have been a settlement with a less than favorable reputation. Sea caves, for example, are also ideal to boat ships sheltered from storms and views, and Crete has many of such caves that are immediately accessible from the sea. The sheer number of small coves and inlets of Crete provided ideal hiding spots for pirates, and the further away from a major coastal settlement that had sufficient authority, the easier it was for freebooters. Small hidden creeks, such as those at Sisi, used to launch attacks against the Ottomans. That of Aias Nikolaos or Cape Sidero, that you see on the screen, would have also been ideal to hide before preying or ambushing passing ships. Why do pirates do what they do is perhaps a redundant question, and both Salins and Renfrew stressed how piracy is a form of negative reciprocity, an attempt to maximize personal gain from the transaction. Perhaps we could call it also a form of direct access, getting things where you can directly without paying or giving something in exchange. For the Bronze Age, we will never know whether the exotica and wealth in the different settlements of funerary context we encounter are the result of pirate activity. And here I have to watch out if Jack Davis and Sherry Stocker are not listening, because the eclectic nature of the Griffin warrior's assemblage does not rule out, I think, that this gentleman was occupied with less than honorable activities. And the same may be true for the other rich but eclectic Mycenaean tombs as that on Skopelos. I will come back to unusual wealth in otherwise mediocre archaeological context in a bit. Apart from transmittable wealth, the epics and later historical sources inform us that slaves, and especially women, were sought after. According to a study by Robert Davis, between the 16th and 19th century AD, more than 1 million Europeans were enslaved by Barbary pirates. And of course, we know from the Linear B tablets of Knossos and Pylos that there was the presence of foreign women in the service of the palace at Pylos. Women from Knidos, Lemnos, Miletus, and elsewhere were employed by the palace, usually in the textile industry, and they were explicitly called Rawiaya, translated as captives, hence announcing a passage in the Iliad where Achilles boasts of the women he captured in the area around Troy. Slaves in general are mentioned in the Linear B records, but the references are relatively rare, so I would not exaggerate official state acquisitions via piracy. Whether other elements, such as the terracotta spools used in the textile production that show up regularly in late Minoan and late Hellenic 3A, B, and C contexts, suggest the presence of foreign women, seems a reasonable suggestion. But we are unable to tell whether these women form part of a larger population movement or whether they were captives acquired during raids or bought in slave markets from pirates. The oddity is also that the prizes given at the Homeric funeral games, tripod basins and craters, gold, horses, cattle, and women, are probably also those that were most prized by pirates. And it's probably not a coincidence that Achilles brings out these prizes from his ships. We even have less evidence when it comes to material traces of acts of piracy. That such things, attacking and robbing ships at sea, were happening in the Bronze Age is of course alluded at by the reference to Lucca pirates or Missi in the Amarna tablets, and I think we'll hear about that tomorrow. And seems also suggested by the scene on the north wall of the flotilla fresco of Acroteria. This shows two main events: a sea scene, usually dubbed the shipwreck scene, and a raid on land. The first scene shows a captain with outstretched arm, position of authority, and at least 3 nude people with a different hairstyle, drowning in front of his boat. And with them are floating shields and shepherd sticks, suggesting they may have been warriors. The nature of this scene is quite different from that on the opposite wall, where it's all peace and quiet. Are these the ancestors of the Barbary pirates? Unfortunately, the scene is fragmentary, so we cannot judge the nature of the ships involved and whether the 2 partly preserved ships were manned by a crew similar to the drowning people. The second scene, the land raid, is immediately above, so some connection can be assumed. Here, 8 shield and spear carrying warriors with boar tusks helmets are heading inland and up the hill where a dozen cattle are assembled, presumably to be taken away. The warriors are probably the good guys, but they are involved in what we may perhaps assume as piracy. We can hypothesize that there is a general connection between these scenes, and then the mixture of sea and land raids are suggested. The flotilla scene in general, and many depictions of ships in Aegean and non-Aegean iconography, as Vasil Samaras has stressed and discussed also in part by Yannis Nakas today, show that at least the means and techniques of naval warfare were available, and this from an early moment onwards. But can we add some more archaeological indicators? Coastal cities with important defensive structures can evidently be interpreted in both ways. Either as a protective measure against pirates, or pirates protecting themselves against potential people wanting revenge. Although there are few historical parallels for pirates constructing themselves serious defenses, they seem to be quite lazy. Often they take over existing sites that may have been fortified by the first inhabitants. They are in fact not so keen in spending much of their time and energy into communal work. The size and prosperity of a coastal settlement do not exclude its role as a potential pirate's nest. We should not forget that, for example, Chandax, present-day Heraklion, was the main pirate city of the Aegean during the 9th and 10th centuries, when it was in the hands of Arab Moors coming from Spain. But in this case, there's of course ample literary evidence. Many scholars, including Hitchcock and Mayer in several papers and following Nowitzki, have argued that the collapse of palace administrations during the advanced late Bronze Age opened the way for pirate attacks throughout the Aegean, and especially in Crete. Following Thucydides, it would have provoked the abandonment of coastal areas. And again, likewise, our own excavations at Sisi and Malia illustrate this phenomenon during late Manon 3B. In both sites, rooms were simply left with their objects in place, only metals were missing. Were these pillaged or simply taken along by the original occupants? We don't know. The abandonment of regions can evidently also have other causes: natural disasters, epidemics, environmental change, etc. Hence, blaming pirates should be based on an in-depth analysis. There are, of course, plenty of historical parallels for such causal relations, but including early modern Italy that suffered from Barbary pirates, and a link between piracy and the location of settlements inland is the usual explanation to explain the presence of sites far from the coast, especially in the Cyclades, as for example, and we heard this example already today, Exomvuro on Tinos. Diodorus Siculus also mentions that the Sicani built their settlements on strong inland hilltops in fear of pirates. But also in East Crete, modern inland settlements, such as those of Palekastro and Zakros, Epano-Zakros, have been explained as forced displacement following piracy attacks by North African raiders. And Moody and Rackham, for example, in their book, have dubbed the Far East Corsair country because it suffered so frequently from pirate attacks. This would then lead to a contrasting synchronous settlement distribution pattern, with first, perhaps only a few defendable settlements with a strong population left on the coast, strong enough to face off pirate attacks. Two, an occasional pirate's nest in a more hidden location to avoid detection. And three, a more general presence of smaller inland settlements at a safe distance from the coast. Enduring coastal settlements, such as Chania, may have resisted and represent the first category of sites. Pirate nests, again, may have been located in different bays east of Nisi Pandalemon, for instance, the promontory below Vorokastro. And one of these, Elias Tonisi, was defended by a wall. Its date, however, is not entirely clear. Location and isolation may be important criteria to judge the nature of a settlement, but even this is not clear. The site of Kolokorafi, I hope Anastasia Tsigonaki will forgive me, which is present under excavation, is really located in the middle of nowhere, in between a rocky coast between Heraklion and Retinon. An ideal candidate as a pirate lair if it wasn't that this coastal settlement forms just one of a chain of coastal sites in the Bronze Age, which could then suggest that its function was exactly the opposite, to patrol and protect the coast and prevent piracy. The famous Captain Spratt in the 1860s describes the presence of guard posts or lookouts upon the most conspicuous eminences along the whole coast of Crete as distances of 8 or 10 miles apart, whose beacon fires blaze upon that dusk if a vessel comes in sight, in order to warn the neighboring villages' authorities that a strange sail is off the coast. It is doubtless a custom handed down from the earliest times, especially when piracy was frequent. So that's still in the 1860s. And Nikos Paniotakis has also identified a series of sori, beacons, that could be used for signaling, and Stefan Soetens has noted similarities between the Venetian lookouts, as represented by this Venetian map, and the location of peak sanctuaries. Could these, and there was some allusion already by when it was talk about Kithra, could these, besides their ritual functions, also have been an early warning system protecting the Cretan coast during the heydays of Minoan culture? And then there is the question of pirate attacks of coastal settlements. As I said, they don't leave their signature, and thus it's difficult to blame pirates rather than another adversary for the destruction and pillaging of a settlement. We heard also this morning about the site of the late Cycladic 3C site of Koukenarias on Paros. Because of the discovery of bodies within the destruction layer, its excavator, Dimitris Kilardi, blamed pirates, but apparently the site was not pillaged, which would be strange in case of a pirate attack. Each site, in fact, should be explored in detail. How did the destruction happen? Was it partial or complete? Pirates would, I think, rarely entirely destroy a site, since it would be to their benefit if the settlement recovered so that it could be pillaged again. The city of Bergen in Norway, for example, was pillaged by pirates in 1428, 1429, and 1432. If a site was pillaged, do we find objects from one culture in another area? Is there a concentration of unexplained wealth in a coastal settlement, like at Moklos, or even Petras? A case in point could be the Palace of Knossos. Undefended as it is, it lies only an hour's walk from the shore, a bit more than 5 kilometers. We may evidently ask whether Knossos, as Athens, Rome, and so many important other cities, were located inland with the pirate threat in mind. Pirates tend not to venture more than between 2 and 10 kilometers inland, not to jeopardize an eventual retreat. Whether Knossos was whether Knossos was ever accessible by small boats through the Kairatos River from Katsaba is unlikely. Moreover, it was hidden by the sea, from the sea by the Zafarpapura hill. But a well-organized group could have attacked, plundered, and burnt the palace and park, leaving only linear B tablets and pottery behind. Since there's only little evidence for looted material on Crete itself in late Minoan 3A2 and 3B, this may have ended up in some other region of the Mediterranean. In any case, Knossos Palace was burned and nothing of value was left inside. In their 2016 book, Pieces of 8, More Archaeology of Piracy, Ewan and Russell seek to answer whether it's possible to determine piratical behavior from recovered artifacts, deciding eventually that, and I quote, the golden age of piracy, 17th century Caribbean, may have been too short to leave a fully developed pirate culture that is clearly recognizable in the archaeological record. And this brings me to my final point. Can we explain the presence of considerable wealth, especially with varying ethnic origins, that shows up in modest settlements as being booty acquired during pirate raids? Again, Mochlos and Psira may represent examples of such sites in view of the rich finds made there, but here I concentrate on the site of Pila Kokinokramos on Cyprus, the excavation of which I've been involved in since 2014, together with Joachim Bretschner of the University of Ghent and Athanasi Akanda, the Mediterranean Society in Heraklion. It is a site which, since its initial excavation by Porphyros Dikeos and Karyogeorgis, has been connected to the Sea People, a group also often assumed to have been involved in pirate activities. Hitchcock and Mayer see Mapa Lekastro on the west coast of Cyprus as a pirate settlement. Its location on the defended peninsula makes the site indeed a good candidate. Moreover, it was a short-lived settlement, and we heard that as one of the criteria today, perhaps occupied for less than a generation. But could Pila Kokinokramos also be considered as one? Both Ma and Pila are short-lived settlements, suddenly abandoned. In the case of Pila, its now silted-up harbor was in fact an inland lagoon, and hence its ships could well have been hidden from passing boats. At the same time, it is close to land and sea routes, and within a day's sailing of the rich coasts of Lebanon and Syria. And if we look at the settlement of Pila too, there are some features which render this hypothesis attractive. It has a closed circuit wall with bastions and very few gates. But not only is the architecture on the site very homogeneous, at least as far as present evidence allows us to see, with wealthy objects were present throughout, i.e. they're not limited to a few houses, but they are everywhere. They're beautiful stone vases, metal objects, painted pots, jewelry of all kinds, and many of these things come from Egypt, the Levant, the Aegean, or Sardinia. Since pirates' nests are sometimes evoked as places of liberty, of equality, and trade, especially by anarchist writers, similarly occupied as by those who don't want to be governed, and you recognize the title. Pila settlement organization fits the picture. The hidden wealth that we encounter as hoards likewise could suggest that these were piggy banks created by its potential pirate occupants. And perhaps their love for weapons and warlike representations and other criteria that we heard today on the craters and writer can be used as circumstantial evidence. And sort of moreover, only a few months ago, we were able to find more fragments of a ship crater, probably an argolith import, late Hellenic 3B, that although still fragmentary and in the course of restoration, shows a sailing ship with a helmsman and 6 oarsmen. But Mapa Lekastro and Pila Kokinokramos belong to a period during which the Sea People were active, and both sides are by time seen as their settlements. The Sea People themselves are often seen as the first organized major pirate coalition of the ancient Mediterranean, which, if we consider how they are mentioned in ancient texts, seems to correspond to what we assume pirates were doing, attacking coastal cities and wreak havoc on mayhem. Ernest Jung has even suggested that some European-type weaponry and other features that are connected to these sea people could have been brought by warriors from the Western Mediterranean who became pirates of the Aegean. That's the title of his paper. Were they the ones who manned the big brother of the Gurab ship model found in Egypt, sometimes called the Mycenaean pirate ship in Egypt? Most of what I said here is quite, I agree, quite speculative. And I do hope that tomorrow's lectures will really provide a positive answer to my question, can we really talk about pirates in the Bronze Age? But here I stop and I look forward to the presentations and discussions of tomorrow. Thank you.